Mr Chairman, I'd like to speak as someone who I think some members, or at least Sir Roger and one or two others, will remember that I've had more than a passing acquaintance with the SIS and its legislation over a period of years. In fact, I'd like to focus on new section 5A, new section 4AAA, which goes to the discharge of the operational functions of the SIS and the integrity and the professionalism of that organisation. And I say that as someone who I'm sure, as with Keith Locke, who spoke before me, who's managed to fail one of their vets, and knew that I'd failed it because after I'd failed the vet, when I was working as a window cleaner, during the times that I was a student, was after that accompanied while I was in the old Ministry of Defence or Department of Defence building, and part of my responsibility was cleaning the windows of what was probably the predecessor of the GCSB, and which sat in there, and because of the fact that I failed the vet and to make sure I didn't look at the papers, I was constantly accompanied by a pistol-wearing guard to make sure that I looked at the window and not at the desks of which were cleared for the period that I cleaned the windows inside and out. And Mr Chairman, I should say that the most interesting part was that the most locked up room, the most secure room, and it was during the Vietnam War, had a number of books. You could tell what they were working on from the books, but they were the economic aspects of the war against Vietnam. And Lipsky, I think, which was at the stage was the Economics 101 textbook, was the biggest book on the bookshelf of the most secret room within the Ministry of Defence at the time, and the idea that you had to lock that book away, Mr Chairman, when it was readily available to everyone who was doing Economics 1 at the university, was an indication to me that maybe at the time the professionalism of the organisations who were involved in security matters was not quite at its peak. And then, as I was often reminded when I was during the first 6 or 7 years of my parliamentary career by Sir Robert Muldoon, the Right Honourable Sir Robert Muldoon, that I at one stage, and I'm really thank you for reminding me, Steve Chadwick, of the exact words that he used to use. He described me as a long-haired activist, Mr Chairman, when I was protesting against the lack of integrity and professionalism of the SIS, and was in fact arrested in the chamber of the House, and appeared in court and in the Supreme Court, Mr Chairman.
Order. History lessons are all very well, and you learn a lot from them. But 3 minutes is gone, and I'd actually like to hear how that relates to part one.
Sure.
Honourable Trevor Mallard.
And Mr Speaker, the point that I'm getting to was that at the time I had very serious doubts about the integrity and the professionalism of the New Zealand SIS. I think it's fair to say, under the guidance of Brigadier Gilbert, who was the director at the time, and there appeared to be a requirement to have a South African accent, a white South African accent, in order to be employed. The SIS agents were fairly easy to identify and a moustache, and sometimes a funny little forelock thing. As people, the agents were relatively easy to identify because of the lack of integrity and certainly the lack of professionalism around the selection at the time, Mr Chairman, and as a result of that there were widespread protests around the 1977 legislation. Now, since that time, Mr Chairman, I have had the ability to observe, not in any detail whatsoever, because apart from a relatively short time when I sat on the Cabinet Committee which dealt with international economic matters, foreign affairs and security matters for a year or so. At that stage, some matters around the edge which I became aware of. But what I do know is that the biggest check on the integrity, professionalism and the discharge of the functions is in fact the minister who was responsible for them. Mr. Chairman, I often sat outside the offices of Mr. Chairman,
Honourable Trevor Mallett,
of both the Right Honourable David Longy, Sir Geoffrey Palmer, and then subsequently Helen Clark, originally as a whip and then as a minister, for what were unscheduled meetings with the director of the SIS, on which I presume they were, because they were unscheduled, I assume they were to do with a matter of immediate security, and often it would have been a matter of warrants. And the assurance that I can give the House is that those meetings were never short, because I know that, because I waited outside. And I think it's fair to say that the directors of the SIS, and there were, I think, 3 of them over the years that I saw coming out of those meetings, did not always look particularly comfortable. So I think it's fair to say that the interrogation by those Prime Ministers of those directors around their duties was something which was intensive, and they used to go right down into detail. And I think it's my understanding that David Longy, I don't know of any of the others, in fact used to go down to their building and examine the files themselves to make sure that he was getting the story that was appropriate. Now, I think there is a weakness in it, but I'm not sure what the solution is. The weakness in it is it does require a Prime Minister who's prepared to read and to cross-examine. There could well be a problem, but I think when we're having a discussion in principle, I think it's important to identify that. But Mr. Speaker, I just, despite my history of failing and being arrested, I know that we've got to have an organisation. We know we must have an organisation. They cannot. No, it's not a dilemma at all. And they can't operate in the open. It's clear that they can't operate in the open, because if you have a secret intelligence or a security intelligence service, if they told everyone what they were doing, there'd be no point in having one. And so the idea that they don't look at modern electronic communications, and I wouldn't hesitate to say that I'm pretty sure that they're probably looking at this stuff already. They might be looking at it and then using it, not being able to use it for evidence, but building up a case to get a different sort of warrant. I would think that, at least in collaboration with the police, if not independently, they would be doing it now. I think they'd be foolish if they weren't doing it now. But the idea that modern methods of communication can't be intercepted and modern tools can't be used against people who at the extreme could be terrorists within New Zealand is just not acceptable. We've got to have an organisation. It's got to have the tools, and I think that part 1 of this Act, going round the changes to include electronic tracking, for example. I mean, the police. We know the police have had the ability and the legal ability to do electronic tracking for some time. The suggestion that the Security Intelligence Service, whether much less common, much less likely, but consequences which could be much bigger than the sort of crimes that the police are working on. Hopefully it never happens, but they must have the powers, in my opinion, to. Sorry? What about the window cleaners? Well, I think it's fair to say that Confessions of a Window Cleaner was an interesting movie, but I think we probably better not go into the other things other than in the Ministry of Defence that window cleaners had seen while they were window cleaning. But I think it's fair to say at the James Cook Hotel, where I also worked, there were some particularly interesting occurrences that one did see as one was window cleaning. Of course, I shut my eyes immediately. of course, rather than carefully examine what was occurring during the daytime in those. But Mr. Chairman, the Labor Party is supporting this particular part. It's a regret that it is necessary to have it in this country, but it is, and we can't have it any way other than being effective.
Sandra Gowdy.
The question be now put.
I'll call David Shearer.